Sure. Thank you so much, Laura. And good morning, everyone. We are so happy to have you with us, for you taking the time to be with Chicago Wilderness. And we've been working on some amazing and exciting initiatives here around the Green Vision. What you see in front of you is part of that Green Vision. And I'd just like to go over that real briefly as we're waiting for people to come on. So as you can see, it's in a circle, meaning a unity, that all of the goals that we're working on have of equal status and importance to the alliance. And of course, as a four-state alliance, representing all the individuals, the plants, the animals, and the people, it's really important that we work towards these goals. So within these goals, we've got increasing access to nature benefits for all people, taking climate action, protecting healthy water, adding conservation lands, prioritizing green infrastructure, growing with agriculture, and then managing healthy landscapes. And ultimately, the goal here, to break it down, is to have healthy lands, healthy water, healthy people, and thus a healthy planet. We're connecting all of these with working groups and leaders with some achievable goals. And if you go out to the Chicago Wilderness website, you can see those ambitious areas that we're beginning to work towards, aligning with the America the Beautiful 30 by 30 plan. And we also then are working on a very exciting hub. And the hub is the measurement, the metrics that we're going to be working together that ties us all together to tell our story. The work that we're here to do today and to talk about with the work that the justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion component is a thread that's going to run through all of these areas. And it's been really important that the Alliance plays a role in addressing racial injustice within the conservation community and developing strategies that need to be deployed to work towards these issues. It's really important to us that the Alliance is a safe place for shared learning, and that's all about what we've been working with August Ball from Cream City Conservation, which you're going to be meeting in just a few moments here. The working group has been a broad, diverse group of those individuals that are definitely committed to this journey, but also that have been involved with the Alliance either very intimately or loosely, but they're very committed to conservation in the area. And I just want to put a shout out and thank them for their time, which has brought us to where we are today. This program and the funding for our work on JEDI, as many other initiatives, is through the Illinois Department of Natural Resources and their Urban and Community Forestry Program. So we thank IDNR for their support and all their efforts in this. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Laura, for any additional comments.
Thank you very much. Again, I want to welcome you all here today. Thank you, Elizabeth. And we're going to turn this over to August Ball from Cream City. And I would prefer that you all keep yourselves muted until we have been invited to unmute ourselves for the discussion today. But this program is being recorded. It will be placed on our website for more viewing for 1 month. And we were also going to repeat this workshop on August 26th, same time, 9 to 11:30. Registration will be dropped into the chat shortly. If there are colleagues, staff, friends that you know that might want to listen to this and be a part of this, please invite them to join us on August 26th. And we welcome additional participation at that event as well. So thank you. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to August Ball from Cream City. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laura and Elizabeth. Good morning, everyone. So my name is August Ball, and I am the founder and CEO of Cream City Conservation. For those of you who are not familiar with me or the work of my organization, I come to you from the ancestral lands of the Menominee, Ho-Chunk, and Potawatomi people here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I've had the pleasure of serving on the Wisconsin Governor's Climate Action Task Force, as well as the Milwaukee and City and County Climate and Economic Equity Task Force, inclusive of service with the Green Leadership Trust, which is based out of DC, but supports environmentalists who are serving on boards across the nation, environmentalists who identify as people of color, as well as completing service with the U.S. Water Alliance as a Milwaukee delegate to the water equity team. So we are a social enterprise, which means that we take the proceeds from the consulting work that we do, such as workshops like this, private consulting with individual clients, and then we use those funds to provide paid training and employment opportunities to young adults right here in Milwaukee. So this is not an exhaustive list of organizations we've supported and had the pleasure of working with, but it's just to give you an idea of who we support. So if you're not familiar with social enterprises, you can think of Tom's Shoes or Warby Parker, eyeglasses. And so I have been doing work in the space of diversity and equity within the environmental realm for roughly 15 years. I did get my start working as a curriculum specialist for AmeriCorps and had the pleasure of also working with the Student Conservation Association, managing their Wisconsin chapter. And so this work is very close to my heart, as I'm sure it is to all of yours. So we all know that it's no secret that our industry is not representative of our labor force. It's also not representative of the people who are hit first and worst by environmental hazards and climate change. And so it's my personal belief that we have to simultaneously cultivate the next generation of environmental leaders while also preparing the existing industry to be ready to engage this new generation of environmentalists. This is not to say, however, that traditionally excluded people have not been doing conservation work, have not been leading the charge in environmental justice. They absolutely have. But oftentimes those individuals, those groups, those communities do not receive recognition. And so our social impact focus is on ensuring that young adults of color, women, queer folks actually have a space and a place for themselves in the environmental sector. And so we do this in a few different ways. You can see here, these are a few pictures of some of the programs that we run. You may also notice our local Lieutenant Governor, Mandela Barnes. So a few of the programs that we run specifically here in Milwaukee are our conservation crew, which works very closely with our local parks department. This crew focuses on invasive species control, trail building, and they also do some wildlife management. We also work in the space of green infrastructure, and we do this in partnership with our local Metropolitan Sewerage District and our local Workforce Development Agency. This program introduces careers in green infrastructure to young adults ages 17 to 21. They also learn how to engage the community in green infrastructure tactics such as rain barrel downspout disconnects, installing rain gardens in their homes, informing residents about flood remediation, and also what they can do to, again, support the aging gray infrastructure that many of our cities across the nation are grasping with. We also work in the space of food sovereignty through our urban agriculture program. This program teaches young adults who are 15 to 19 and enrolled in high school how to grow food from seed. They learn about soil science. They also learn about the foundations of food sovereignty. They also sell their produce that they grow at 3 different growing sites around the city to local chefs. And before we were navigating the global pandemic, we're working with local chefs to create custom salads that were sold at our brewer games on Sundays. This year, however, we've decided to simply donate the proceeds, the produce that has been grown at our various gardens. And this also is a partnership with our local public school system, the Boys and Girls Club, and our University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's Office of Sustainability. And we also have supported the work of the Alliance for Climate Education, now known as Action for Climate Emergency, in helping them foster their fellowship program in both Milwaukee and Wisconsin in 2018 and 19, respectively. So this program has evolved to be more of a decentralized model now, but I'm very, very proud of these high school students who through their hard work, their virtual activism, were able to engage over 20,000 people in registering to vote in the last election. New this year, we started this program actually in April, is our Fresh Coast, Fresh Start program, which is a reentry program for returning citizens who are interested or could be interested in a career in green infrastructure as well. This program supports adults who are needing a career that will help them not only be part of the green economy, but will provide a family sustaining wage. And this is also a partnership with our local Metropolitan Sewerage District. As our climate continues to change, we are going to need to be even more innovative with addressing the stormwater capture needs. And I'm really, really proud of this program. It will commence in October. And we already have guaranteed employment for the graduates of this program, which if any of you have ever done workforce development programs, that is oftentimes the missing piece. So I'm very, very excited for the future for the participants of this program and for our city here in Milwaukee as well. So I always like to start off my workshops with an image that grounds me in why I do this work. And I'm sure, like many of you, why we do this work is very multifaceted, right? We don't live one-dimensional lives. For me, I like to remind myself of the young people who are going to inherit whatever we leave them. And so these are some students of mine who've been in some of our programs over the years. So our learning framework for today, friends, is built on the theory that we can foster awareness, inspire inquiry, and produce change behavior. This workshop is not intended to tell any of you what to think or how to feel, but it is intended to challenge some existing attitudes, beliefs, and perspectives that you may hold in light of new information or potentially new information. The methodology that I work from is to explain the historical construction of race, to show how the system of racism drives the inequitable outcomes that we continue to see across all social systems. I also work to help people and organizations like yourselves understand the implications of race on our identity development and assess the ways that race impacts our socialization and how that informs our role and agency in society. It is also my intention to support us in assessing the ways that we might be unintentionally upholding some of these problematic dynamics in our policies, our practices, our organizational cultures. And lastly, but most importantly, it is my intention to help foster a learning community that is grounded in vulnerability and trust so that we can actually collectively strategize to produce change. Now, in order for us to have an environment that is safer and allows for vulnerability, we have to intentionally co-create that culture together. I wish that a space was safe simply because I said it was so, but unfortunately I don't have that power. And so I'm relying on all of you to help me co-create our culture together. Culture in any setting gets set very fast. And if we don't intentionally co-create it together, oftentimes it can manifest into a culture that isn't helpful in getting us to our desired future state. So I'm going to present you all with some group agreements for your consideration. These group agreements will apply to all of our sessions going forward into 2022. I will bring them up and remind us of these group agreements each session. If you can agree to hold yourselves to these group agreements to the best of your ability, please do type into the chat, I agree, once I've presented all of them. And if there are any group agreements that you cannot hold yourself to, please do unmute yourself and let me know where I may have lost you. So the first agreement that I want to offer for consideration is to stay in relationship. This means I invite you to pay attention to when you might be shutting down, especially in light of information that might bump up against truths that you've held and also experiences that you may have had. And speaking of experiences, I also invite you to experience discomfort. Discomfort, after all, is catalytic to growth. And if this work were comfortable and easy, we would not be on this webinar right now, right? We would have already done the work. To that end, I invite you to expect and accept non-closure. If I do my job right today, you are going to leave this session with more questions than answers. But it is my intention that you will leave this session with better questions. This means that when we are engaging in challenging conversations, we have to be okay with the fact that things may not always turn out the way we hoped they would. We may not always leave conversations, spaces of learning, feeling as though everything turned out with a resolve at the end. This work is ever ongoing. I invite you to listen to understand. Our identities have meaning and they hold weight. And while our identities are not shaped in a neutral environment, it is even more critical that we take note of our identities, the power that they hold in spaces, and also mindfully manage our very human need, oftentimes, to feel called to debate over listening, as well as perhaps not comparing our experiences to someone else's, especially when our identities are not the same. Next, I invite you to speak your truth and to be open to the truths of others. We are all going to be at different places in this work, and where we are along our equity and justice journey has very little, if at anything at all, to do with our character or our intelligence. It is simply the manifestation of the information we have had the opportunity to be exposed to. Now, if we have the opportunity to be exposed to information and we simply choose to ignore it, well, then that is another matter. I invite all of us to be accountable for our own growth in this work. So friends, this is my offering to you all to establish a safer, more liberated environment for us to dialogue and learn. If you can agree to these group agreements, I invite you to type into the chat, I agree. And again, if you can identify any agreement that you are not able to abide by, please do unmute yourself and let me know which one is a challenge. Thank you. Okay. So Albert Einstein once said that if he had an hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes studying that problem and 5 minutes solving it. In my 15 years of creating and facilitating racial equity workshops and consulting, I've noticed one of the key non-starters to this work is the fact that many of us are using terms that are not actually the same interchangeably. And we are also using terms in collective conversation where there hasn't been established shared language and definition and understanding for those words. And so many of us may find ourselves in hostile conversations because we are at a disadvantage in the knowledge of how we got here in the first place. We are also at a disadvantage because we actually don't fully understand the meaning of sometimes of the words we have, or we think we are using one meaning and our colleague that we are in conversation with has a completely different definition of that word. So my hope today is that we are going to begin addressing some of those limitations and establish a foundational understanding. We're going to do this by defining race, interrogating its historical construction, developing some shared language around the historical and structural and cultural analysis of racism. We're going to examine the role of public policy in contributing to racial oppression. We're going to define racial equity and identify the behaviors, mindsets that advance and hinder racial equity. And we're going to conclude with introducing the concept of allyship and co-conspiratorship. I'm wondering if I could have a volunteer read this definition from Dr. Milana Karinga about race. Not all at once, friends.
I'll read it.
Thank you, Nicole.
What is race? A specious classification of human beings created by Europeans during a period of worldwide colonial expansion, using themselves as the model for humanity for the purpose of assigning and maintaining white skin access to power and privilege, and to legitimize the dominance of white people over non-white people, end quote.
Thank you. So what does specious mean, friends?
Doubtful.
Doubtful? Oh, you're far more intelligent than I, Nicole, because when I saw specious, I immediately thought of species. And I like to blame the fact that English is not my first language, but I don't think that's what it is. But you're right. So specious means superficially plausible, but actually wrong, right? So when we break this down, this very itchy definition of race, we're seeing here that it is a superficially plausible, but actually wrong process of classifying human beings. All right, well, now we know what it is. But when was this superficially plausible, but actually wrong process of classifying human beings introduced, created? Well, during a period of worldwide colonial expansion. And so colonialism began roughly around the 1400s to the 1600s or so. It is still happening today. And who created this superficially plausible, but actually wrong process of classifying human beings during the 14th, 16th century? Europeans did. But why? Well, for the purpose of assigning and maintaining white skin access to power and privilege, and to legitimize the dominance of white people over non-white people. So with this understanding of what race is, what then is racism? I'd like to offer that racism is but a system. It's a system of advantage and disadvantage based on the idea of race. And a system is simply an established way of getting things done, right? So with that in mind, and understanding our current society, racism, therefore, involves the systemic disadvantage of people of color. It has been built into our US systems and institutions. It's been woven into the economic fabric and political and social structures of America. And here's the rub, friends. The system of racism continues to thrive because both the oppressed and the privileged groups are socialized to play their roles as normal and correct within this system. Now, we often hear the terms racism and racial prejudice used interchangeably. And I'd like to clear this up because I think this is one of those non-starters in terms of disrupting racial inequity. Racial prejudice is the preference for or against a particular racial group. However, racism is the combination of racial prejudice and social and institutional power. And when we say social and institutional power, we're referring to access to resources, the ability to influence others to get what you want done, and the ability to define reality for yourself and others. So therefore, when we are talking about racism, we are referring to racial prejudice in favor of white people and against people of color. Friends, why is it so hard for us to talk about race and racism? Why does this make us so itchy? Steve, go right ahead.
I think it's because talking about race tends to make people feel are being attacked for being racist.
Yeah, thank you. Ed, did you want to add something? Anyone else?
Because if you talk about racism, that means you have to acknowledge that you have, or you're afraid that you have to give up your power. People don't want to give up their privilege and power. That's why they're uncomfortable to talk about race and racism.
Thank you, Jamal. So let's talk about the various levels of racism, right? Because we often in our society are faced with the conditioning that racism automatically equals violence and hatred. And I'd like to expand on our understanding of racism. And I'm sorry, I'm going to remute everyone here, just so we don't have too much background noise. So there are basically 4 key levels of racism. Internalized racism is the personal conscious and oftentimes unconscious acceptance of the dominant society's views, their stereotypes, biases, essentially internalizing that whatever the dominant group is, that is the norm, right? That whiteness is right and normal, and everything that is non-white is to be compared against it, to be otherized, exotified. Interpersonal racism is the harassment, exclusion, marginalization, and discrimination, hate, and even violence against people of color. Now, what's important to note here is that many of us are far more familiar and comfortable talking about interpersonal racism because it tends to be more visible. And internalized racism involves a lot of psychology. It involves a lot of personal reflection that many of us simply don't have the tools to begin interrogating. Institutional racism is the racism that is built into policies, procedures, and everyday practices of our organizations, our government. This determines culture, whose comfort level is prioritized, who gets to succeed, and who receives support. Systemic racism is when these institutional impacts of racism intersect, overlap, and reinforce and amplify the different treatment that people of color receive in comparison to the treatment that whites receive, ensuring different outcomes. Based on how you were raised, friends, the information you were conditioned with, how do you get ahead in America? And you can feel free to type into the chat or unmute yourself. How do you get ahead in America? I see education and hard work, assimilation, inheriting generational wealth, building upon that privilege, network, rugged individualism, be the best. Yeah, pursue opportunities if they are made available to you. Yes, thank you. So most of us here in North America have been taught that the antidote to success or the pathway to success is to work hard. Whatever that might be, whether that is increasing your effort in school, at a job, building a business. At the end of the day, the requirement is simply increased effort. I'd like to interrogate that understanding a bit further today. Raise your hand if you are familiar with a man named John Punch. John Punch, if you've ever heard that name before. Okay. So, okay, Susan, all right, we got one. Great. So this land that we are on, friends, do you know what it was called prior to being the United States of America? No, I see some in the chat. Yes, Aaron, Turtle Island. Yes. So we are on Turtle Island. And prior to colonization, this Turtle Island was inhabited by numerous communities. And colonizers from Europe set out to discover this land and acquire it, colonize it. And they brought with them a system known as the headright system. So in order to colonize a land, you need to have a critical mass of people infiltrating that land. And so to get more people from Europe to come to Turtle Island to help colonize this land and take it from its original inhabitants, Europeans were offering each person that would purchase a boat ticket to come to Turtle Island 50 acres of land. Now, because it was mostly the wealthy who had the means to take advantage of such opportunity, they certainly were not interested in tilling this land themselves. And so many of them engage in a practice known as the headright system, which was indentured servitude. And so let's say a man named John Smith purchases a boat ticket for himself from England, and he now has 50 acres of land. And he also purchases a boat ticket from England for 2 other people to come over and work on that land. John Smith now has 150 acres of land and 2 people to work that land for 4 to 7 years without having to pay them anything. So prior to Turtle Island becoming the United States of America, this practice of indentured servitude was widely committed, was widely practiced. And there were people from all over the globe coming forward and working as indentured servants in order to come to this new world and start a new life. However, the conditions for indentured servitude weren't much better than slavery itself. If a female or a birthing indentured servant were to become impregnated, either through assault or any means, their servitude would be session would be extended. They could not testify against their master, and they virtually had no human or civil rights. John Punch came to this country as an indentured servant. And he worked alongside an Englishman and a Scotsman. I'm sorry, a Scotsman and an Irishman, sorry. And the 3 gentlemen decided that if they wanted to live, they probably needed to escape their indentured servitude because the conditions that they were working within were making it so that they weren't sure they were going to survive the tenure of their indentured servitude. So the 3 of them ran away. They ran away and were captured and were sent back to Virginia for trial. The 2 white indentured servants were sentenced to additional time in servitude as punishment. John Punch, being Black, was sentenced to life enslavement, thus becoming the first documented Black man to not only receive a different sentence for the same crime as a white man, but also to be documented, placed into slavery. Now, throughout this time, we had numerous rebellions that were occurring between poor white farmers and the wealthy bourgeoisie who were getting the highest quality of land and just sitting on it because they could. And so folks from all different ethnicities, right? And I should say, during this period of time, we didn't have concepts such as white or Black. People were typically referred to by their ethnicity or their country of origin. And because folks of all different ethnicities and all different walks of life were banding together to revolt against the bourgeoisie, the House of Burgesses decided that it needed to quell this stuff immediately. And so it came up with the concept of the white man. And the House of Burgesses created the definition for what a white man was, and then assigned various privileges to that. Those privileges included the requirement that any master who had a white indentured servant was required to provide that white indentured servant upon the completion of their servitude with 50 acres of land, 30 shillings, a musket, and 10 bushels of corn. However, if your indentured servant was not classified as a white man, you didn't have to provide them with anything. This, my friends, began the foundation for white supremacy ideology, patriarchy. And in fact, the Virginia House of Burgesses still exists today. It's known as the Virginia House Assembly. So as these sort of tactics fostered the beginnings of white supremacy ideology, where wealthy aristocrats would refer to white male workers as hardworking and diligent and committed to their service, whereas those who were non-white would run away and couldn't be depended upon and were lazy. We also have the introduction of the Land Ordnance Act. This meant that if you were classified as a white man, you were able to purchase land for $1 per acre. In 1790, we also introduced the Naturalization Law, which specified which immigrants were eligible for naturalized citizenship, the rights to vote, the rights to own land, and having civil rights. Only white immigrants were included in that law. The scientific justification for this racial hierarchy was then instituted to combat the growing abolitionist movement. Now, I find it interesting that our country has more statues to Confederate generals than it does to abolitionists, which I think is very telling about our country's history and also current state. Now, due to this growing abolitionist movement, the bourgeoisie and the US government enrolled the services of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. Blumenbach was a German anthropologist who was charged with studying the skulls of the quote unquote races. And what he found through studying the quote unquote Mongoloid race, Negroid race, Caucasoid race, was that there was actually no biological difference in any of the races. And so he placed in his report, still it be found serviceable to the memory to have constituted into certain classes in which the men of our planet may be divided. Now, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach was not the individual who created the various quote unquote racial categories. That was this guy, Swedish naturalist Carolus Linnaeus. But it was Johann Friedrich Blumenbach who decided to create a pyramid, a hierarchical structure, if you will, dictating that the Caucasoid race was the most closest in quote unquote God's image, the most beautiful, the most perfect, and placed the Negroid race at the very bottom of his racial hierarchy structure, and thus increasing the impact of global anti-Blackness throughout colonization, the process of colonization. In addition to this, we have the Indian Removal Act. Now, naturally, with the colonizers giving away all this land, that meant that they had to get rid of the people who were already here. And so you may know this as the Trail of Tears, in which over 4,000 members of the Cherokee Nation alone died from hunger and disease from being violently forced off of their land by white colonizers. When criticized by abolitionists about this policy, President Andrew Jackson said it was not the greed of white settlers that drove that policy, but the inevitable fate of an inferior people established in the midst of a superior race. A few years later, we have the very short Mexican-American War, in which 55% of Mexicans went to sleep on Mexican soil and woke up on American soil with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. What I find fascinating, friends, is that if we were to superimpose a map of where the original Mexican border was versus where the US border is now, and we compare that to residents of Mexican origin or descent, it tells quite a different story, doesn't it, than the story that we hear about quote unquote illegal immigration. The Homestead Act of 1862 allowed for 85 million acres of Native American land to be stolen and sold off exclusively to whites for $1.25 per acre. I'm going to share a short video with you in a moment. And I want to preface this with the understanding that language is constantly evolving. And the author, the speaker in this video uses a term that I don't recommend we use, and that is referring to enslaved people as slaves. It is important to note the dehumanizing impact that our words can have. That being said, the information beyond that in this short clip is very valuable. So I just wanted to preface this video with that. In addition, friends, I invite you to Google $5 Indians after this session so that you can inform yourselves of the results of some of the policies that were intended to rectify these heinous acts of the US government and to find out what the results of those policies actually were.
All right, let's set context first. By 1830, most of the Native American tribes, especially in the Northeast, have been annexed, sent away, have been destroyed, have been broken up. But there are hundreds of thousands of Native Americans that are living on Indian territories within state borders down south. We're talking about Florida, we're talking about Alabama, we're talking about Georgia, we're talking about Mississippi. There's a humongous pressure that's building on the federal government by poor whites down south. They want to get their hands on this land. So they elect their leader in 1828, and that's the Democrat Andrew Jackson, who makes it his mission to free up this land. And he puts his ink on his first big piece of legislation in 1830 called the Indian Removal Act. And it's a squeaker. It passed the House, I believe, by only one vote. And there was a lot of opposition in the North. A lot of missionaries were against this because they saw Native Americans as being acculturized, as becoming civilized, as being brought into the Republic. This was Jefferson's and Washington's idea, and they'll have nothing to do with this forcibly removal idea of Andrew Jackson. There were even some Southerners against it, like Davy Crockett, the congressman from Tennessee, who voted against the Indian Removal Act. Yada, 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 it passed. And now Andrew Jackson has the ability, they say negotiate treaties, but really to force treaties on these Native Americans and to forcibly remove them with state militias from their homes. And that's what begins to occur as soon as this law is passed. All 5 of the civilized tribes, we're talking about the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, we're talking about the Muscogee Creek, the Seminoles, the Cherokees, are going to be rounded up and at gunpoint sent thousands of miles to these new reservations on federal land, not state land, over in Oklahoma, and that land's going to be taken away also. We also have court challenges. A lot of the Cherokees felt that their best avenue wasn't to fight with guns and with bows and with arrows, but rather to go to the Supreme Court. And a really, really big decision comes out in 1832. It's called Worcester versus Georgia, where John Marshall actually sides with the Native Americans and says, you can't forcibly remove these guys. These guys have a right to their land like everybody else. And I think Andrew Jackson's words are something akin to John Marshall made his decision. Now let him go enforce it. And he goes on to say that if you light a fire under these guys, eventually it'll get hot enough and they're going to leave. And those treaties begin to get signed right away. We have the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. We have the Treaty of New Ecoto. We have a number of treaties that starts forcing these Native Americans out. The Seminoles, however, would have none of that. They were the only tribe that fought to the end. And thousands of them ended up in the Florida swamps, living out their lives, many of them intermarrying with slaves from that area. But the majority of these Native Americans, the 100,000 plus, are going to be put on the Trail of Tears, thousands of miles to Oklahoma. 1/4 of all Native Americans on the Trail of Tears died on the way from disease, from starvation, from warfare, from being attacked by whites. A really quick story is one of the tribes was crossing the Ohio River in southern Illinois, and the ferry operators were charging these Native Americans $1 a head when they were charging whites 12 cents a head. And there were hundreds of those Native Americans that froze on the side of the river waiting for the ferry because they couldn't afford to cross. But there we go, guys. At this point, by 1838, we have really wiped the South the Southeast at least, east of the Mississippi, clean of Native Americans, and that land is gobbled up quicker than you can say gobbled up by whites. They actually had lotteries where they were giving this land away to poor whites who wanted that land. So the Native Americans are now pushed off to these reservations, some of the worst land in the country, in the dry, arid, deserty land of Oklahoma where nothing really grows. And then even there, they're going to be pushed farther into the interior with further discoveries of oil and such like that. So the Indian Removal Act, it's a really ugly episode of American history. Remember the Trail of Tears, and remember Andrew Jackson, he don't care about the Supreme Court, at least not when it came to that. So I hope that you'll.
So this image here, friends, showcases the shift in control from the original inhabitants of this land to colonizer control today. The US government has entered into over 500 treaties with Native American bands and tribes, and it has violated or broken every last one of them. In addition to the land of the indigenous people of Turtle Island being stolen from them and experiencing the violent removal, genocide, the US government and missionaries also intended to steal the very identity of Native American children and their descendants. One of the most powerful and vicious tactics the US government and missionaries committed against the indigenous people was the introduction of what was called Indian residential schools, which were actually can be classified correctly as camps. The most notorious camp was the Carlyle Industrial Training School. The philosophy behind this movement was to kill the Indian and save the child. Native American children were taken from their families, oftentimes forcibly, and sent off to live in these camps that were heavily subsidized by the federal government, as well as through donations through the church. Parents who did not willingly hand over their children to these schools, these camps, were sent into jail or prison. In these schools, the children were forced to cut their hair. They were prohibited from speaking their indigenous language, from oftentimes seeing their family members, speaking with their siblings. Survivors of these Indian residential schools, as they were called, have gone on to write memoirs of surviving indescribable physical and sexual violence at the hands of the administrators of these schools. In Canada, over 150,000 First Nations children, roughly, this number is constantly increasing as we are finding more and more bodies of children in the locations of these schools, were sent to live in residential schools. In America, here in the US, over 60,000 Native American children were estimated to be taken from their families and enrolled in these camps. Enrollment for these camps reached its highest point in the 1970s. The last school or camp was closed in 1996. At the time of the creation of these slides, we estimated that 1 in 45 of the children had died in the residential schools, but just in the past 2 months alone, we've found, I think, an additional 615, I believe, as of last week, bodies of children found in these schools without any grave or list of cause of death. Could I have 2 volunteers read these quotes from our former President Teddy Roosevelt?
"19th century democracy needs no more complete vindication for its existence than the facts that it has kept for the white race the best portion of the new world's surface."
Thank you, Ted. And can I have 1 more volunteer?
I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th.
Thank you. I share these quotes from our former president because as an environmentalist myself, and you may have noticed this as well, that many of our offices, when that was a thing, when we would go into offices, tend to have imagery of individuals like Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir. And I want to make sure that we are fully aware of the layeredness of our forefathers, not to take away from the contributions that they have made to the environmental movement, but to call things as they are, not better, not worse, but simply as the truth. Now, speaking of Teddy Roosevelt, in most of our industry, he is held in high regard as the first environmental president. What I find interesting about this, friends, is that Roosevelt and his party, during their Kenyan expedition, killed off more than 11,000 animals, including elephants, hippopotamuses, and the white rhino. The pay-to-stay trophy hunting policies that were introduced by Roosevelt sustain a very racist modern myth that wealthy hunters buying government licenses to shoot big game and keep the animal parts for whatever they wish pays for wildlife conservation across the globe. In truth, we actually don't have any evidence of this being the case. What we do know, however, is that trophy hunting policies, pay to stay trophy hunting policies, are extremely exploitive and end up causing additional harm to local communities who are in turn prohibited from sustenance hunting and farming to make way for these wealthy big game hunters' recreation activities. Now, John Muir is also credited with establishing the Yosemite National Park, but what is oftentimes forgotten or failed to mention until recently, I think some of us are gaining more knowledge recently about John Muir and the layeredness of this man's actions and thought processes, is that while the language of the grant for the National Park Service noted that the area was to be left for resort and recreation, to be left inalienable for all time, it completely disregarded the fact that the Miwok tribe had been thriving in that valley, caring for the land for nearly 4,000 years before John Muir stepped foot on it. What is often also left out conveniently out of our history textbooks is the violent actions of the National Park Service as they eradicated the land of Native Americans to make way for white male recreationers. James John Audubon, which many of our nature centers are named after, was also fairly aligned with the actions of Muir and Roosevelt, receiving much acclaim and credit for his works on the Birds of America engravings. Many of those works, of course, were informed through the information and specimens that were collected by Indigenous people and enslaved Black men, of which he referred to in his writings as simply hands traveling alongside white men. As I mentioned about the over 500 treaties that the US government entered into and the fact that not a single one of them remains either unbroken or violated. In 1953, the federal government, after discovering additional resources, minerals, oil on the land that had been reserved for Indigenous people, terminated that policy and those treaties to gain power over those lands, consequently ending the sovereignty and trusteeship that the Indigenous peoples had over those reservations. This was presented as a means to enfold the Indigenous community into US law, but what it actually did was de-recognize over 100 tribes and bands as sovereign nations. In fact, this impacted more than 12,000 Native Americans, including Wisconsin's own Potawatomi tribe. For many of these tribes, it took them over 30 years to get re-recognized by the federal government. In between that time, of course, many of those Indigenous people and communities and tribes went without any land or source of income. We also have the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that I want to highlight for us to understand, again, additional policies that have contributed to where we are today in society.
This is not yet another ethnic oppression story. This is a very American story. Chinese Exclusion Act forbid Chinese to immigrate to the United States, and those who were here were not allowed to become citizens. Chinese, they are so different. They're taking our jobs. They cannot become Americans.
There was no immigration policy before the Chinese came. So if you ask an American citizen, hey, when was it determined that if you're born here, you're an American? They would have just said, what do you mean? That's the oxygen we breathe. That must have been part of the Constitution. No. In 1898, it was decided that all persons born in the United States are United States citizens, no matter what. The Chinese Exclusion Act was blatantly unconstitutional.
It reflects how America saw itself at one time and how it continues to see itself. Some of it has to do with the fact that we excluded Chinese for 60 years.
This history really is the beginning of where we are today. The issues we're asking, who can come and who cannot come? Who can be American?
So the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first time that a nationality was barred from immigration by name.
August, you're muted.
I am? My mute button's not on.
August, we're having a difficult time with your audio.
Okay, what about now? Still no?
Not yet, no.
Interesting. Still nothing?
No, it sounds like your microphone.
I'm not sure. I'll check.
Yeah, someone suggested upping your volume control.
Still nothing?
You're very faint at this time.
Yeah, my sound will not go up anymore.
You know, it was fine until the video started. I wonder, is it still pulling to a different screen or something?
Ana Garcia is saying, I can hear you if I turn my volume up all the way. Interesting.
You're back. You're back.
I am back. Okay. All right, let's try this again, friends. Okay, you can still hear me well? Okay.
Perfect.
Oh, technology. It's great when it works, and then it doesn't. We're like, what do we do? Thanks for your technical grace, everyone. Okay, so the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was passed by Congress in 1882, along with and signed by President Arthur. It initially lasted for 10 years, but then was extended for another 10 years in 1892 in conjunction with the Geary Act. The Geary Act then required people of Chinese origin to carry identification cards or face deportation. So what this meant was, even if you were born here in the United States, if you were of Chinese descent and you were caught, quote unquote, without having your your certificate, you could be deported to China, even though you'd never been to China. Later measures were placed to restrict the movement and freedom of the Chinese, limiting their access to bail bonds and only allowing entry into the US by those who were designated as teachers, diplomats, students, and wealthy tourists. Congress then closed its gates to Chinese immigrants almost entirely for another 10 years in 1902, and then made that extension indefinite in 1904. In 1943, Congress passed a measure to repeal the discriminatory exclusion law after much protest and pushback, but then replaced it with an immigration quota for China of only 105 visas per year, consequently limiting the access of Chinese to the US even more than the Chinese Exclusion Act. In addition to this, we move into the 19th century, and you may all recall the Emancipation Proclamation that was, well, actually, what was the Emancipation Proclamation about? Does anyone remember that from second grade civics? What did the oh, go ahead, Del.
Yeah, it freed all slaves who were in the South, who were part of the Confederacy.
Yeah. So thank you, Bill. So the Emancipation Proclamation, it was intended, well, liberated those who were enslaved in the South, yes, in the Confederate States, and only in the Confederate States. And while President Abraham Lincoln is touted and presented as our, first abolitionist president, many historians are now questioning that, considering that 2 years later, the government signed into power the 13th Amendment, making slavery legal for anyone convicted of a crime. Consequently, in conjunction with this, we have the introduction of black codes. Now, black codes were intended to make what would otherwise be legal activity if one were white, illegal if one were not white or one were black. This was pre-Jim Crow, and so in case you are not familiar with black codes, I'm going to share a very short clip. And hopefully my sound doesn't go out again.
In November of 1865, the government that Andrew Johnson had set up in Mississippi passed a set of oppressive laws that applied only to African Americans. Soon, other Southern states followed suit. These laws became known as the Black Codes.
The basic purpose of the Black Codes was to recognize that slavery has been abolished, but to make sure that there is as little change from slavery to freedom as possible.
The key to the Black Codes was what they called vagrancy laws, things like that. Every adult Black person was required to sign a labor contract for the year with a white employer. If they didn't do that, they would be considered a vagrant and they could be fined. And if they couldn't pay the fine, they could be auctioned off to someone who would pay the fine. And then they'd have to work off the fine for that person.
What's even worse than being arrested if you don't have a job is having your children taken away. So your neighbor down the road can go to the courts and say, John Jones, he can't take care of his children. He's indigent, but I'll take them in. And I will train them in farming methods, or I'll train the daughters in housewifery. And I will have their labor, and the parents will get a little bit of money at the end of their period of indenture. But Black parents didn't have a say in this.
A lot of parents are fighting back and saying, no, they don't want their children to be apprenticed. They can take care of them. They also know that in apprenticeship conditions, they can't protect their children from physical and sexual abuse. It becomes a way for the planter class to continue stealing the labor of the children and sometimes stealing the children themselves.
Enforcement of the Black Codes went hand in hand with relentless violence against the freed people.
Outside of cities and towns, the Union Army was shrinking rather than expanding. You're looking at former slaveholders who can't imagine living in a world where slavery doesn't exist if the Union Army is not on the ground and the Freedmen's Bureau is not there to enforce the new rules. then they were going to do whatever they could to keep the African American population in a state of subordination.
The Ku Klux Klan is created in Tennessee in 1866. It coincides with the creation of black codes. You could argue that on some levels that the Klan is doing the same thing that the slave patrols did. During slavery, the slave patrols would make sure people have passes, making sure that they are not loitering. They're not getting together in bands of people. And the Klan is going to do the same type of thing.
You have people who are targeted because they've managed to acquire a decent amount of land, or their children are in school and a white person in their community is struggling at the same time. What they decide is that the way to deal with this is to attack the person, to take away everything they have, to destroy their property, to run them off their land.
At war's end, Frederick Douglass had wondered what new form slavery might take. After 6 months of Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction, the answer was painfully obvious.
So hopefully you all can still hear me now. Can you? Can folks hear me or no?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Okay. So slavery did not end in 1863. As Brian Stevenson says, it simply evolved. Brenna, I see you have your hand up. Did you have a question or a comment? Oh, okay, gotcha, no worries. So, oh, Pete Jackson, do you have a comment or a question? Okay, no worries, we're moving on. So in addition to this, as we expand through our history, in the 1920s, we have the introduction of Jim Crow segregation. Now, remember in the beginning where I mentioned that upon the founding of this country, we didn't have these concepts known as the white man or a Black person. People were simply referred to as their ethnicity or their country of origin. And that meant that only certain individuals were classified as white to begin with. This was typically only your Northern Europeans. So if one were Irish, Scottish, Italian, not white. But if you were German, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, you were considered white. So up until 1922, those Europeans from Southeast, or sorry, Southern Europeans rather, petitioned the courts to be designated as legally white so that they could gain the privileges connected to whiteness under the 1790 Naturalization Act. And they won. And so with this now increased definition by our laws about what a white person constituted, Virginia once again introduced a new law to protect the racial hierarchy, introducing racial integrity laws. This was intended to prohibit race mixing, protect the creation of the concept of whiteness, and was not overturned until 1967's Loving versus Virginia case. To your left here is a photo of Mr. and Mrs. Loving, who petitioned the courts to be allowed to marry. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be exploring some additional US policies that have contributed to the racial inequity that we see today. I'm a huge proponent of us shifting our language away from using terms such as social determinants of health and moving into political determinants of health, because that more accurately describes what is actually causing the disparities that we see. Some examples of these political impacts would be the Social Security Act. Now, for whites, the Social Security Act created a public assistance program that allowed for millions of American workers to have a safety net. Unfortunately, however, for non-whites, it excluded domestic and wage workers. who were typically farm workers, maids, which consequently disproportionately impacted the Black population. 75%, in fact, of the Black population fell into those categories of employment due to restrictions on the work that people of color could obtain. The Wagner Act, which made labor union monopolies legal and helped millions of white Americans gain entry into the middle class over the following 30 years, also allowed for dominant unions to discriminate against membership based on race and gender. In fact, the American Federation of Labor successfully lobbied against the prohibition of racial discrimination in unions and won. The Federal Housing Act, which also helped generate much of the wealth that white families enjoy today, allowing them to leverage the equity in their homes to send their kids to college, pass down family wealth, and take care of their parents in their old age, was overtly denied to people of color. It also helped establish redlining to justify denying financial services to certain neighborhoods based on the ethnicity and race of the residents. In case you are not familiar with redlining, it is the practice of assigning particular areas as high credit risks for mortgage failure, purely due to the racial and ethnic demographics of the inhabitants of the area. This is a map, a portion of Milwaukee County, but redlining existed all across the United States. And so you'll see here these blue-lined and green-lined areas were typically deemed best in class. 91% of the areas across the nation that were classified as best in the 1930s and were restricted to white residents only remain to this day 85% predominantly white and upper income. I also invite you to Google racially restrictive covenants so that you can find out what some of the restrictions were connected to redlining. So the GI Bill of 1944 also contributed to the disparity in results that we see today. For white families who have served their country, they were promised and received government guaranteed housing loans, access to rising property values in the suburbs, and exclusive opportunities to create new household wealth. One key tactic that white families did in order to build their wealth through the government guaranteed housing loans that they had access to purchase high quality property in the suburbs would pull out some of the equity in their homes and then purchase property in those redlined areas for cash and then rent them out to folks of color. And because people of color had such limited spaces in which they were allowed to live, the owners of those properties had very little reason to maintain the quality of those homes. It was not uncommon for folks of color who were living in the redlined areas to be paying more in rent for dilapidated buildings than the white families were paying for their high quality homes in the suburbs. For Black families, as I mentioned, home loans were overtly denied. They were excluded from purchasing homes in the suburbs, which were at the time restricted via redlining and racially restrictive covenants. Oftentimes restricted to redlined neighborhoods, and the segregationist admission policies of the day meant that due to very small seats in the historically Black colleges and universities, many of these Black soldiers were not able to avail themselves of the education awards that they were promised for serving their country. While this information may feel quite heavy, I also want to note that despite all of these policies and practices that were instituted to intentionally oppress an entire group and groups of people, we still had the success of numerous Black neighborhoods that were thriving despite all of this. Many of them ended up being known as Bronzevilles. One very famous wealthy Black neighborhood was known as Black Wall Street. And Today, we refer to this as the Tulsa Race Massacre in accordance with what occurred with this neighborhood. Many, in fact, almost all of the prominent Black neighborhoods across the nation who were able to thrive despite all odds against them, all seem to meet the same fate. And I'm going to share with you a video of what occurred to just one example of a thriving Black neighborhood.
We generally call it the catastrophe because we feel like it wasn't a riot. We were not the perpetrators, we were the victims. But it took 80 years to get the state of Oklahoma to acknowledge that.
The Tulsa Race Massacre is believed to be one of the worst incidents of racial violence in American history. From May 31st to June 1st in 1921, as many as 300 people were killed, hundreds were injured, and thousands of buildings were destroyed.
On June 1st, they began to systematically destroy neighborhoods, and they had airplanes dropping things down on people's houses, and they had made up their minds to clear the entire area of Black people.
It started after a newspaper reported a Black man tried to sexually assault a white woman. Though it's still uncertain what exactly happened, many did not believe that story. The Oklahoma Historical Society said the most common explanation is Dick Rollins stepped on Sarah Page's foot when he entered the elevator, causing her to scream. A group of armed Black men went to the courthouse to offer help protecting Rollins once they heard talks of lynching. A crowd of white men was also on the scene. A shot was fired and the riots began.
My parents were very distressed because here they are with 5 kids, and the schools had been. I went to Dunbar School, and that was reduced to just rubble. I mean, they blew it up.
Crowds of white rioters went to the Greenwood district, known as Black Wall Street. It was home to an affluent African-American community with banks, hotels, theaters, and new homes.
They took my 8-year-old brother too, where they were holding all the Black men. And we didn't know because we lived on one side of town and they lived on the other. We thought they were locking up the non-Blacks too. But it so happened that it didn't occur that way. What they did was to disarm and lock up all Black men. And then they said to the mob, there's nothing out there now but women and children, so you can do whatever you want to do. And that was when the real terrible things started to happen.
It ended when the city was placed under martial law and National Guard troops were deployed. But Black Wall Street was devastated. Survivors never received compensation for what they lost.
So between 1934 and 1962, the US federal government backed over $120 billion in taxpayer money for home loans. More than 98% of that went exclusively to whites. In 1954, we have the desegregation of our school system with the passing of the Brown versus Board of Education. What is often not discussed, however, is the lost year. The lost year is the story of Governor Faubus's protest against having to integrate his public school system. In protest of this, Governor Faubus shut down the public school system in Little Rock, Arkansas for an entire year, leaving poor whites and people of color with no education option for an entire year. Wealthy whites who were able sent their children to private schools. The teachers who were employed through the public school system also went without employment for an entire year. This produced significant strain on the relationships cross-racially in Little Rock, Arkansas, as poor whites turned their anger towards the Black community members. In 1971, President Nixon declares the war on drugs and identifies drug abuse as public enemy number 1. And between 1974 and 2014, the federal prison population increased by over 600%. Today, 2/3 of those imprisoned are Black, Latinx, and Indigenous. In the 80s and the 90s, the Reagan and the Clinton administrations expanded the war on drugs and increased nonviolent drug offenses, which also increased our prison population from 50,000 people to 400,000 people by 1997. The Great Recession of 2007 to 2010, which is also known as the housing bubble, saw the wealth of Latinx families fall by 44%, Black families fall by 31%, and white families by 11%. So friends, when we take into account just how young the United States of America is, I hope that it can help us illustrate or evaluate that these matters did not occur a long, long time ago. In fact, we have only been in desegregation for 52 years. We have existed in slavery at minimum 364 years. The number is actually quite closer to 400 years. And then segregation with the Black Codes, Jim Crow era for 104, and with the passing of the Fair Housing Act and the Voting Rights Act, allowing women, Black women rather, the right to vote in 1965. We have only been quasi-liberated for 52 years. I'd like to pause here and give ourselves about 5 minutes of a break to process what we've gone over so far. When we come back, we are going to explore how these various policies, practices, choices impact our communities today. So let's return at 10:31, actually 10:30 Central Time. Okay. So Laura, if we could pause here, that would be great.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, friends, I welcome you all back. If you can give me a thumbs up, just so I know you're back. Or you can type, oh, awesome. Okay, I see you all now. Great. All right. So let's talk about how this history, this very recent history, impacts us today. Well, when we think about how most Americans acquire their wealth, it's typically connected to property. And since only a subset of the population has had access to purchasing and acquiring property, that has resulted in a very distinct wealth gap. In fact, the wealth gap has nearly tripled between white families and Black families since the 1980s. Right now, the median household wealth for a white family is over $200,000, whereas for a Black family, it is around $28,000. And even when we account for education, we see that race, more so than education, is a key determining factor of wealth. What we know from research is that white high school graduates are still out-earning college graduates of color. When we look at our public school system and we compare the percentage of which students are suspended or expelled, we see that, again, race is a stronger indicator for school discipline than actual likelihood or rate of engaging in poor behavior. What we have found, however, is that the key difference, while there is no discernible difference between the behaviors of Black children, Latinx children, in comparison to white children, the way that administrators within these school systems are responding to children is, however, different. And is discernible. This is also where I mentioned that most of our public school systems are managed by white women. And another entity in our society that is heavily controlled by white women is our foster care and social service industry. Children of color are referred to Child Protective Services at a substantially higher rate than white children. They're more likely to be reported as victims of abuse or child neglect. They're more likely to be removed from their homes and are also more likely to spend time in foster care or other substitute forms of care. In fact, Black children are twice as likely to be represented in the foster care industry than white children, than in the general population, rather. I just want to share a short personal story with this because I want to drive home the fact that there are real people behind these numbers. So I am the daughter of a mixed race marriage, and my mother was white and my father is Black. And my mother passed away when I was young, when I was 4, and my parents were separated at the time. Now, typically, when one parent passes, the children go and live. They are given custody to their parent, the other surviving parent, unless that parent is designated as unqualified, unable, or unwilling to be the legal guardian of those children, which was not the case for my father. My father was actually a prominent business owner in Racine, Wisconsin. Now, because of my family's status in the community, my maternal grandmother wanted to have custody of us because she knew that we would come with some money. And so a judge ruled that while a custody battle was going on between my father and my maternal grandmother, my sister and I, 2 Black girls, would be placed in foster care for almost a year. Now, I luckily had a decent experience in foster care, but imagine the impacts psychologically, emotionally that might have on a 4-year-old child and a 6-year-old child after losing their mother and being sent to live with strangers in addition to that for almost a year. Once my father was able to place any of our inheritance into a small trust, my maternal grandmother no longer pursued custody of my sister and I, and we were immediately sent back to live with our father. Again, I share this with you, friends, to remind you that this is something that occurred in the 1980s. I am not alone in this. I could share numerous other examples and stories of real people who make up these numbers. In addition to that, we have the race and maternal outcomes, where we find that, yet again, race is a stronger indicator of infant mortality rates than education attainment or native language of the mother. What we know is that stress and racism are constant factors in the lives of Black women, and they are inseparable from their pregnancy experiences. We know that Black women are 60% more likely to deliver their babies early than white women, and Black babies are 230% more likely than white babies to die before their first birthday. What we also know, however, is that the main antidote to this is when the physician themselves is also Black. Now, we know that women in general have a very challenging time getting our local medical institutions and physicians to listen to us, believe us. But the disparities in health that this causes around the internalized racism in the medical industry can't be denied in the outcomes that we are seeing. So here are some examples of infant mortality rates in connection to the education of the mother and the race. When it comes to drugs and incarceration, race, again, is still a stronger indicator of likelihood for incarceration than actual usage of illicit drugs. In fact, white community members are substantially more likely to utilize illicit drugs than Black community members. Yet, when we look at who is represented in our prison complex, we can see the height of incarceration for Black individuals substantially rose during the height of the war on drugs. Now, our perception of self and others is very much so informed by the messages that we receive from the broader dominant system. And we see this occurring in the messaging that is received against individuals who have substance abuse or suffering from substance abuse. When white drug users are portrayed, they are typically portrayed with empathy, as they absolutely should. That same empathy, however, is not typically awarded to individuals of color. But it's not only when we are having conversations in the media about substance abuse that we see this racism in the media manifest. We also see this manifest during natural disasters, where, much like John Punch, Black individuals and other individuals of color are sentenced differently in the media for doing the exact same thing as whites. How individuals of color are portrayed consistently across the media has a very consistent theme. And even being connected to the royal family is not enough to absolve individuals of color from media racism. Now, as I mentioned in the very beginning, one of the primary reasons I believe we should all be invested in ensuring that the environmental movement is not only inclusive, but led by people of color is because people of color have the most firsthand experience navigating environmental degradation, hazards, and environmental impact. In fact, this impact manifests in real time. Excuse me. I want to expand our understanding, though, of individuals who have been credited with many, with the movement that we are all part of. Again, not to take away from any of their accomplishments, but to highlight the layeredness of our heroes, Aldo Leopold, Prince William, and my beloved Jane Goodall have contributed amazing things to the movement of environmentalism and conservation, but they also share in common one thing, And that is the perspective that population control is the key solution to mitigating climate change. Now, the primary concern with this mindset is that it does not take into account the fact that the world's 10% rather of the world's richest populations produce almost as much greenhouse gas emissions as the bottom 90% combined. In addition to this, I want to point out that Aldo Leopold has been held in high regard for his work and writings around having a land ethic. The same land ethic, by the way, that had been subscribed to, lived, embodied by Indigenous people to this day, as well as prior to Aldo Leopold being a thought in the universe. And yet many Indigenous people have been persecuted for utilizing their Indigenous practices, such as engaging in being a relative of nature, and also engaging in land stewardship practices such as prescribed burns, which many Native Americans had been scapegoated when we had situations such as forest fires. We are now, of course, learning that many of these Indigenous practices are very valuable and we're starting to uphold them. But of course, the damage has been done. Speaking of conservation practices and policies, I want to present just 3 examples of how public policy produces inequities. The Wilderness Act of 1643, which was presented as a tool to create recreational space for serenity seekers and naturalists, created the limitation and in many cases prohibited Indigenous tribes and communities of color from practicing sustenance farming, fishing, and hunting. The National Park Service Organic Act, established with John Muir in 1916, produced the violent removal of Indigenous tribes from their homeland, created segregationist policing structures of public green space, and thus promoting racial disparity in access to nature. The intent standard, established in 1976 by the Supreme Court, requires that plaintiffs, which are typically vulnerable, low-income, and Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, to prove a perpetrator's discriminatory intent in order to win an anti-discrimination claim. What this does is allow for oftentimes corporations to continue erecting incinerators in communities that are already disproportionately bearing the brunt of environmental hazards, simply because the residents of that area can't prove that that corporation is intentionally trying to harm them. Environmental justice advocates are working to get that policy replaced, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I want to ground us in some shared understanding of what environmental racism is. Environmental racism can be defined as any government or industry action and failure to act that has a negative environmental impact that disproportionately harms, intentional or not, individuals, groups, and communities based on color or race. How this manifests in real time, as an example, is through the air that we breathe. We know now from substantial research that 71% of Blacks, 50% of Latinx, and 34% of whites are breathing polluted air. We also know that Blacks are exposed to 56% more pollution than they cause. Latinx are exposed to 63% more pollution than they cause. And whites are exposed to 17% less pollution than they cause. Now, as I mentioned before, environmental justice advocates are working to get the disparate impact standard used in place of the intent standard. Yet, friends, when we think about where we are today, when we consider the compounded impacts of generational slavery, genocide, state-sanctioned violence against people of color that continues, targeted race-neutral policies, exclusionary wealth accumulation policies, and racist immigration and naturalization laws, we have to understand that this is what is funneling and producing the racial disparities we see today. And if we are a citizen of the United States, part of the legacy that we have inherited is the historic, systemic, and pervasive way in which whiteness and the benefits, privileges, and power for those who have come to be known as white have been constructed in this country. So I have a question for you. How do you get ahead in America? We have so many wonderfully constructed Band-Aids. We have after-school programs that teach children how to read because our school system is failing to teach children how to read. And that is not at all a judgment against educators by any means. We are discussing the system here. We have community gardens and food banks to address hunger. We have pop-up clinics to address inaccess to healthcare. And all of these things are well and fine. But unless we are actively addressing the root cause of these inequities, everything we do is simply putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Until we actually face the reality that the root cause of these symptoms of inequity are a direct result of systemic racism, we are going to continue to be but hamsters on a hamster wheel. Now, in order to change the racially inequitable outcomes that we see, we have to change the systems and the people that produce them, whether or not those people, those individuals, are participating consciously or unconsciously in maintaining them. James Baldwin once said that the past is all that makes the present coherent. And further, the past will remain horrible for exactly as long as we refuse to assess it honestly. So I'd like to give us a moment to reflect in our small groups. I'll be partnering you up with someone. And in your partnership, I'd like you to consider, what were you thinking and feeling throughout our time together so far? How does this history align or differ from what you've learned in school? And how does it impact the way that you currently think about race, both in the broad context and in the context of your own racial identity? So while you're contemplating that, I'm going to create some breakout rooms. And you will have just roughly 10 minutes, so 5 minutes each. This will not be fast by any means, but I do hope that this will simply be a seed planting experience. And I hope that you do continue these conversations, these reflections with members in your community, your colleagues, your family. Are there any questions before I open up the breakout rooms for the next 10 minutes? Okay. All right, I will see you all in 10 minutes. And Laura, if you could pause the recording here, that would be great.